bed, holding his hands down tightly and begging Max not to push him away anymore. Lucas brought over some delicious bean cakes for Max, knocking on the door to say Apple had brought some cakes to share. Suddenly Lucas heard strange noises coming from inside. Max called out there was no need. Lucas asked if Ethan wanted any. Weren't they hungry? Pressing his ear to the door, Lucas heard sounds resembling a fight. No, their temperaments and relationship were very good. How could they be fighting? Lucas figured they must be doing something he couldn't participate in. He left the cakes and departed. Inside, Ethan pleaded with Max to take him home. He could give Max anything he wanted, even his own life. Ethan touched Max's chin, but Max still avoided him, refusing to go with Ethan. 3 days later, the horse had fully recovered. The Sil tribe joyfully thanked them. Ethan gave the horse an apple he had just taken from the spacecraft. The chief asked what it was. Ethan answered it was a sweet apple. If they wanted to eat it, they'd have to sign a contract first. Max contemplated that in this perpetually cold place unsuitable for growing this fruit, Ethan was capitalizing on their unfamiliarity with apples to trick them into signing. It was quite clever. Ethan looked at Max expectantly, hoping to be praised. Finally, the tribe agreed to sign the contract. If there were any children needing care, they could all be brought over. They would provide food and shelter. Max said they would depart tomorrow. That night, Ethan tightly embraced the sleeping Max in bed. Suddenly, the screen lit up. Someone urgently contacted Ethan, but afraid the light would wake Max, Ethan pressed the communicator to his own ear while covering Max's ear. Ethan then shouted in fright, in 5 minutes a 5.3 magnitude earthquake would hit the Sil tribe's area. They had to quickly flee. Max woke up and Ethan recounted the news. While 5.3 magnitude meant nothing elsewhere, in a valley between two mountains like this, falling rocks would be disastrous. Ryan urged them to escape as only 3 minutes remained. Ethan pulled Max and Lucas outside, but Max wanted to notify the others to also flee. However, Ethan retorted that he no longer valued his own life. With 3 minutes left, there was no way to evacuate over 500 people. Max shook Ethan's hand off and ran to warn as many people as he could. The ground started shaking and rocks raining down as the tribespeople panicked and ran every which way. Ethan yelled for everyone to take shelter by the mountain. Not seeing Max, Ethan started worrying. He couldn't let anything happen to Max. Ethan frantically ran around looking for Max amidst the earthquake. He saw Max helping a mother and child. As Ethan went over, a large boulder fell from the cliffside. Without thinking, Ethan pushed Max out of the way but got buried under the rocks himself. Max desperately tried to move the boulders off Ethan, refusing to leave despite Ethan's pleas. Luckily, the earthquake didn't last long and others came to pull Ethan out. Max's heart ached to see the bloodied young man before him. Placing Ethan on his lap, Max asked someone to call a doctor immediately. He then took off his jacket and covered Ethan's body. Ethan's hand gently touched Max's trembling hand. Suddenly, Max heard Ethan congratulate him. From now on, Max could escape him. After Ethan finished speaking, he fainted. Facing life and death, Max finally became honest with himself. He cried while hugging Ethan, repeatedly shouting for Ethan to keep living. He didn't want to escape Ethan anymore. He loved him. Max told Ethan not to die and leave him. As long as Ethan pulled through, Max would stay by his side forever, never separating again. At that time elsewhere, Lucas and Edward were intimately caressing each other like newlyweds. Their bodies pressed tightly together without the slightest gap, surrounded by a rosy atmosphere unsuitable for children or single dogs. Edward sidled even closer to Lucas, vaguely hinting, but Lucas refused since they were still outside. Edward petulantly said it was fine since they had done so before. Lucas' entire body stiffened upon hearing this. He sighed and hugged Edward tightly. Sitting in Lucas' lap, Edward teasingly asked why Lucas was jealous of himself. Before the loving atmosphere could continue, bad news came falling from the sky. Ethan was in an accident and Max was with him at the military hospital. Lucas and Edward rushed over. Upon arriving, they saw a dazed Max sitting outside the operating room covered in dirt and bloodstains. Edward panicked, asking where Max was injured, but Max drearily replied the blood was Ethan's and he was unharmed. Lucas suggested Max rest a bit, but Max insisted on staying to wait for Ethan's surgery to finish since he still had something to tell Ethan. After who knows how long, the operating room doors finally opened. Ethan's surgery was very successful in preserving his life, but several more were still required. Hearing this, Max was relieved at last. He asked if he could visit Ethan yet, but the doctor replied Ethan still hadn't woken up and needed 2 more hours. At that, Max suddenly fainted into the other's arms. Max was given a full physical examination and then awakened in a patient room, immediately asking about Ethan. Edward stopped Max from moving too suddenly, saying Ethan had woken up in very good spirits. But Max was still uneasy, directly yanking out his four, determined to find Ethan. Edward thought he had never seen his brother so anxious before. Thank goodness Ethan was fine, otherwise Max might have collapsed. Edward was even more incredulous that his brother liked a rough, arrogant man like Ethan. After helping Max to Ethan's room, he obediently waited outside. Seeing Max arrive, Ethan was very surprised. Max asked if Ethan's body was all right, and Ethan said the doctors had cleared him. Ethan reached his hand out towards Max, who came over and placed his hand atop Ethan's. Ethan asked if Max was still angry, but Max lightly shook his head, blaming himself that Ethan had ended up this way to save him. Ethan gently kissed Max's knuckles, saying at that time he could only think about Max's safety, unable to consider anything else. Barely feeling touched for a moment, Ethan's wolf tail emerged as he swiftly asked if Max's words during the earthquake still counted. Max shyly said yes. Ethan happily hugged Max tightly and then used his wristband as an improvised ring, sticking it on Max's pinky finger. He knew he was wrong and hoped Max would give him a chance to correct things, using this whole lifetime to make up for it and make Max happy. Max happily agreed to Ethan's proposal. Sometime later, Lucas and Edward's child was safely born. They held a small 100-day celebration banquet, only inviting close friends. Ethan came in a wheelchair to pick Max up from the station. Max was both moved and worried the wheelchair would be inconvenient for Ethan, but Ethan said he had come to see Max earlier. Basking in affection, Ethan shamelessly hinted for Max to kiss him. Unable to resist Ethan's coquettishness, Max could only kiss him and then sighed. This child had learned to be sly, no longer relying on force but switching to retreat for advancement, acting coquettish. But Max was also secretly glad Ethan finally learned to respect others. Max suggested going straight to Edward's house. He wanted to see what his nephew was like since he hadn't called them recently. Ethan sulked, saying the baby looked as dumb as Edward and could only hope he inherited Lucas' intelligence. Hearing Ethan insult his younger brother, Max retorted that Edward was very good and his flaws were due to Max's poor upbringing. Max warned Ethan not to think badly of Edward anymore. Ethan resentfully said it would be fine as long as Max doted on Edward less. He was jealous that whenever Edward appeared, Max no longer cared about him. When getting in the car, Max moved to carry Ethan, but Ethan, afraid of tiring Max, said he was too heavy and just needed a hand up. Max distressingly said Ethan had become much thinner over the past few months. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan asked to be compensated for Max's heartache. Once aboard, Ethan hugged and kissed Max, unexpectedly caught by Edward, who had come down to check on their delay in entering. Seeing the intimate scene of the two, Edward was embarrassed and covered his face with his hands. Ethan was annoyed at the interruption but had no choice but to release Max. The two gifted Edward expensive presents to show off and hoped he would view Ethan differently, no longer competing with him over Max. But the oblivious Edward didn't notice anything amiss until Max helplessly explained things clearly to avoid Edward being tricked. The banquet proceeded peacefully. Everyone is very happy with this grandson. That night Max wanted to stay over, but a fierce pampering war broke out between Edward and Ethan. Finally, through coquetry, Ethan successfully claimed victory, leaving the vexed Edward to watch his brother get dragged away by the wolf. Edward furiously ruffled his hair in frustration. Lucas could only console him powerlessly. At the same time, Lucas was also jealous of Max. Edward's reaction to Max and Ethan being affectionate was too extreme, easily leading to misunderstandings that Edward's feelings for Max exceeded familial love. Edward dove into Lucas' embrace, insisting they were blood brothers. How could Lucas be jealous of his brother? Lucas retorted, then was he supposed to be jealous of Ethan instead? The one Edward hated yet almost became involved with? In another room, Max was helping Ethan bathe, who kept asking for sex, but Max firmly refused due to Ethan's wounds. Under Ethan's coquetry, Max promised that once Ethan recovered they could do anything. They then exchanged kisses and loving words. The next day the Trin family elder came to visit his grandchild, happily carrying the baby, then suggesting they take a family photo to bring back to the geothermal sphere as a memento since he would soon return. Hearing this, Edward said he would go fetch his brother and Ethan, but at the mention of Ethan, Elder Trin's expression darkened, clearly still unaccepting of their relationship. But out of obligation for Ethan saving Max's life, this time he wouldn't nitpick. Later, Edward held his son next to Max on either side of Elder Trin while Lucas and Ethan stood behind them. The six took a perfect family photo. Sometime later, while Lucas was busy with his packed schedule, he suddenly recalled something. He decided to cancel a conference and hastened his journey home. He contacted Edward, but unfortunately Edward was also swamped preparing for an end-of-month press conference, so had to abruptly end the call. Lucas could only sigh and continue. Late into the night, Lucas suddenly materialized in Edward's office, greatly startling him. Lucas complained it had been a whole week since he hugged Edward. Edward could only helplessly explain he was busy and tried to stop Lucas from making a mess. But words held no sway, everything that needed to happen still happened. Lucas said no matter what, they had to meet today. This made Edward very curious about what important matters compelled Lucas to rush over despite his busy schedule. Lucas teased Edward a bit, then the two of them spent a passionate night together. Lucas took out a wildflower, saying when he saw it on the road he suddenly missed Edward and specially wanted to give it to him. Edward sulked, asking if Lucas meant he was like a wildflower, refusing discipline and growing recklessly everywhere. Lucas teased, did Edward want confirmation of his love once more? He then further explained that while the wildflower itself may not hold any special meaning, whenever Lucas saw or thought of something, the first thing he associated it with was Edward, because Edward had engraved himself into Lucas' life, becoming an inseparable part. Edward gently kissed Lucas, saying he liked this gift. He then took out a tie from his cabinet drawer, put it on Lucas, and wished him a happy Valentine's Day. A fiery night passed with the two immersed in passion, forgetting that little Edward Jr. was drowning under the pile of gifts at home they had bought. Edward was in the midst of a not child-friendly dream when he heard little Edward Jr.'s voice calling Papa. He woke with a start to hear his young son chattering away about how Lucas had instructed him to eat a full breakfast. Embarrassed by the earlier dream, Edward could only hurry his son and their dog downstairs first before the cheerful father-son ate breakfast together. Little Edward reminded his father to eat more and not become thinner, or Lucas would be angry upon returning. As Edward assured Lucas, mission this time wasn't difficult, so he'd likely return very soon. Very called to report Lucas' fleet had been ambushed on their way back. The general was gravely injured and undergoing emergency treatment. Edward was immediately rushed to the military hospital. Though not life-threatening, Lucas' head had suffered past injuries, so they needed to wait for him to wake up to check for after effects. Seeing Lucas wrapped in bandages motionless on the hospital bed, Edward could only bitterly cry, asking why Lucas always recklessly charged into danger. Was he the only hero in the universe? If Lucas didn't want Edward to hate him, then he had to wake up. Edward grasped Lucas' hand and fell asleep, slumped beside the bed. When he was startled awake to find Lucas conscious again, before Edward could feel joy at Lucas's awakening, Lucas uttered a single sentence that left Edward shocked. After regaining consciousness, Lucas suffered memory loss. He still retained memories, but they only went up to his youth. Attending neurologist Dr. Daniel Johnson from the military hospital's brain department said Lucas currently had a dissociative memory disorder, believing himself to still be a high schooler. However, this was only temporary. If his brain recovered quickly, he could make a full recovery. Rather than hospitalization, the best treatment was to reenact his school days to recalibrate the disordered memories. At first military high school, Lucas was enrolled under the guise of a transfer student to aid in memory recovery. Edward also pretended to be a student to stay close and assist Lucas' therapy. When Lucas entered the classroom, not a single student dared make a peep, the atmosphere full of tension and pressure. Lucas quickly spotted Edward among the unfamiliar classmates and was very surprised to see him there too. Edward could only lie that his father felt attending a military school would help increase Edward's masculine aura. Homeroom teacher Fairy said the empty seat next to Edward would be good for Lucas since they were friends. As class began, Lucas whispered to Edward that he was very happy they could become deskmates. During the break, Edward took the initiative to go over and tutor Lucas, but unfortunately in Lucas' eyes, there was only Edward's fragrance and body. For some reason, Lucas wanted to hug him, while not child-friendly scenes appeared in his mind. Finally noticing something off about Lucas, whose face was completely red, Edward worried he had a fever and touched their foreheads to check his temperature. Lucas's face turned even redder, shyly pushing Edward away, saying he already knew what to do. He quickly wrote in his notebook and then ran off to buy water. Edward checked the answer, realizing he was the clown. The explanations he had given Lucas earlier were all wrong. He was sighing when the student council president Michael came looking for him to talk. Michael expressed his dissatisfaction with the whole school having to perform to aid the general's recovery. He felt a military school was not an amusement park. He would not lightly accept the disrupted class schedules, interrupted training, and canceled mock exams just to cater to the general's wife's needs. Michael's imposing manner made Edward retreat in fear, nearly stumbling. Lucas happened to see this and angrily told Michael to let Edward go. Lucas thought Michael was bullying Edward, so he got physical with him and pulled Edward behind to protect him. Edward helped defuse the situation with Michael, but Lucas was still angry and warned Edward that the boys at the military school were rough and to keep his distance. Realizing Lucas was jealous, Edward happily hugged him in thanks. Lucas shyly turned his face away, secretly wondering how to confess he'd liked Edward for a long time. After school, Edward went to find his dorm room among everyone's chatter, sighing about the little boy at home being upset he temporarily couldn't go home. Upon opening the door, he saw Lucas changing clothes and pretended to be surprised at the coincidence of their arranged room sharing. When Edward was about to take his things to the public bathroom, Lucas stopped him, imagining others bothering Edward there and getting angry at the thought. Flustered, he said he had already booked a private bath for the two of them. Hearing this, Edward used the excuse that a private bath would have been hard to arrange just to invite Lucas to bathe together, thinking he would surely refuse. To his delight, Lucas readily agreed. Edward offered to scrub Lucas's back. Lucas grew flustered at his touch and hurriedly stopped his hand. Edward pretended to use having a roommate as an excuse to get more intimate. Lucas quickly explained it was his issue, not Edward's. He then saw Edward's face looking bullied and about to cry, asking if Lucas hated him that much. Seeing this, Lucas grew incredibly flustered and turned on the cold water to calm himself before hurriedly running off. Edward noted his reaction and reminded him aloud to beware of catching a cold while happily thinking to himself his plan was tremendously successful. The day after, they had to attend the military school's physical education class, completely contrary to Edward Chen's imagination. It wasn't a scene of sweet basketball games but a nightmare of running with heavy loads. Lucas Peach observed Edward Chen's breathless appearance and immediately inquired if he could persist. Unexpectedly, Michael Brown overheard and, with a smug expression, suggested that if Edward Chen provided equipment to Lucas Peach, he might be able to continue running. However, both of them would face penalties. Lucas Peach advised Edward Chen to take care of himself, then chased after Michael Brown to complete the training. Lucas Peach led and set a new record for the school, not showing any signs of fatigue. Observing a breathless Michael Brown in second place, Lucas Peach suddenly realized Edward Chen was still missing. It turned out he had not completed the training yet, however, his spirit had already left his exhausted body. In the afternoon after school, Edward Chen continued training alone, thinking this time was genuine for Lucas Peach. He wanted to experience the most authentic and beautiful days with him, compensating for the past absence in his memories. With Lucas Peach's support, after 3 days, Edward Chen finally met the standards. With no strength left, he collapsed into Lucas Peach's arms. Quickly, Lucas Peach took him to the medical room for an examination. Besides exhaustion from excessive exercise, blisters had formed under Edward Chen's feet due to continuous running. While the doctor was about to apply ointment to Edward Chen, Lucas Peach grabbed the medicine bottle from the doctor, then carried his princess back to the room and applied the ointment himself. During this, Lucas Peach asked about Edward Chen's dream of becoming a fashion designer and questioned why he had to endure hardship in military school. Edward Chen persistently replied that he wanted strength to protect his loved one. When the person he loved was in danger, he wanted to fight side by side with him. Lucas Peach felt a surge of jealousy but was unable to inquire further as Edward Chen suddenly fell asleep. Sighing, Lucas Peach helped him change clothes, softly pleading whether the person he was striving to catch up with could be him. Unexpectedly, he heard Edward Chen call his name and then received a kiss from him. The next morning, as soon as Lucas Peach woke up, he found Edward Chen sleeping while embracing him. Blushing, he asked why Edward Chen was sleeping on his bed. Edward Chen couldn't confess that he intentionally crawled into bed while he was asleep, so he came up with the excuse that in the blurred state of mind last night while going to the restroom, he mistakenly climbed onto his bed. Lucas Peach, feeling extremely flustered, rolled off the bed. As it was a day off, Edward Chen happily made plans with him to go to the library. He decided to find a book analyzing ancient clothing and jewelry to get inspiration for his fashion brand's main product. After searching for a while, he finally found it but couldn't reach it. Seeing this, Lucas Peach gently helped him retrieve the book. Height, no comparison, no harm done, but due to the proximity, Lucas Peach started blushing and his heart raced. Edward Chen reached up, grabbed his shorter self and pulled him down. Once again, their foreheads touched, testing the warmth for him. This made him even more embarrassed. At that moment, Lucas Peach noticed Michael Brown and deliberately asked Edward Chen to go register the borrowed book, intending to talk privately with him. Lucas Peach arranged a fair competition with Michael Brown and declared that if he lost, he had to retract his bad attitude toward Edward Chin and stay away from him for a while. Edward Chin waited outside the library and didn't see Lucas Peach anywhere. While he was looking around, his hand was grabbed by Lucas Peach. He happily let him hold his hand as they walked back to the dorm. The next day, while Edward Chin was strolling, he heard news about Lucas Peach and Michael Brown's duel. In his mind, he pictured the two of them fighting, and he worried that Lucas Peach's head injury might be affected. However, to his surprise, they were only having a shooting competition. Even though Michael Brown lost, his score wasn't bad. He dared to bet and dared to accept defeat. Michael Brown came up to Edward Chin, apologized for his attitude in the past few days, and affirmed that the general was very strong. Edward Chin thanked him for understanding and promised to try to resolve the personal issue soon and leave the school. Furthermore, he agreed with Michael Brown's assertion that Lucas Peach was indeed strong. The two of them chatted and laughed happily. However, someone far away, Lucas Peach, couldn't hear the details of the conversation. He smelt more sour than a lemon as he carried Princess Edward Chin back to the dorm in front of everyone. Edward Chin was still happily enjoying being carried when suddenly Lucas Peach, feeling uneasy, asked why he transferred schools because of Michael Brown. Lucas doubted if Edward had intentions towards Michael. He worriedly felt Lucas's forehead. Was his head hit and damaged? Did he need to see Dr. Andrew? Lucas didn't care. His face frowned as he interrogated Edward about transferring to the military school because of Michael. Edward insisted that before, he didn't even know who Michael was. Hearing this, Edward hugged Lucas tightly. Lucas didn't want Edward to smile at anyone else. He saw all these thoughts and comforted Edward's face in his hands, his eyes full of love. This made Edward shyly run away. Behind, Lucas covered his mouth and giggled. Turns out amnesiac Lucas wasn't so bad, at least he could look again at Edward's innocent youth. The next day, Michael invited them to join the honor team to participate in the school's founding anniversary event. Edward was very enthusiastic. If they couldn't make the uniforms in time, he offered to take care of the costumes. Seeing Edward's expectant look, Lucas had to go along with him. Just then Michael arrived and perfunctorily asked about their participation, but his gaze was fixed on Lucas, who basically didn't hear what Michael asked. Taking advantage of Lucas's distraction, Michael asked if Lucas liked Edward. Without hesitation, Lucas confirmed it. By the time he realized, it was too late. Michael teased that even in confessing, Lucas was as slow as a snail. Afraid of being overheard, Lucas hurriedly pushed Michael out of the room. Actually, it wasn't that Lucas didn't want to confess to Edward, but he had to wait until he could give Edward a good life. Before Lucas finished speaking, Michael had already twisted his ear and left. He had imagined what it would be like for the general to fall in love, but it turned out he was just secretly pining like a student. This made Lucas angrily shake his fist behind Michael. Before leaving, Michael didn't forget to warn them. That night, Edward came to Lucas's room, insisting on staying over to take measurements for the costumes. Lucas could only tell Edward to hurry up. Actually, Edward had long been familiar with Lucas's body. Taking measurements was just an excuse. Edward's light touch on Lucas's neck made him shudder. Edward's hand moving on Lucas's chest made him impatient. Lucas turned around to press Edward down, one hand already undoing the shirt buttons, exposing Edward's fair, slender body. This was just Lucas's imagination. Edward was trying hard to keep hold of reason. Lucas brought up topics to distract attention, asking about Edward's father and brother. Edward put on an act, bowing his head sadly. His father and brother had been exiled to the burning heat of the volcanic planet, suffering greatly. Listening, even Lucas felt pained. Finally, Edward raised his head with a pitiful smile that directly broke through Lucas's defenses. Lucas went to hug Edward and comfort him, not knowing this little devil was gloating smugly. Still worried Edward might have trouble sleeping, Lucas innocently patted the bed and told Edward to sleep with him.